Now pack your things. Austin's voice was colder than I had ever heard it, and for one full second, I didn't know which woman at that table he was talking to. My mother's hand was still shaking in mine. Moira's smile had already stretched wide, like she'd rehearsed this exact outcome in the mirror that morning. Keith leaned back in his chair with the satisfied posture of a man who'd bet on the right horse. I looked at my husband and realized I had built an entire marriage on an assumption I had never actually tested, that when it came down to it, he would choose me. Austin, I said. Who are you talking to? He didn't look at me. He looked at his mother. You, he said. Both of you. Pack your things. You're not staying here tonight. Moira's smile didn't just falter. It collapsed all at once, like a building with its foundation cut. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what my mother had already survived to get to that table. My name is Renata. I'm 34. I work as a claims adjuster for a regional insurance carrier, and if there's one professional skill that bled into my personal life more than any other, it's this. I notice when someone's story doesn't match their evidence. 10 years of walking through fire-damaged kitchens and flooded basements teaches you that people lie about small things to protect themselves from bigger truths. A homeowner who swears the space heater was always in that corner. A tenant who insists the leak just started yesterday when the water stains say otherwise. You learn to separate what people tell you from what the walls and the receipts actually show. I didn't know, that Sunday, that I'd be applying the same instinct to my own dinner table, cataloging tone of voice and body language the way I usually catalog water lines and scorch marks. 3 months before that dinner, my father died. A heart attack, sudden, in the garage, wrench still in his hand because he'd been fixing the mower for spring. He was 63. My mother, Debbie, found him when she went out to tell him lunch was ready, and she told me once, in the flat voice she used only for the worst details, that the radio in the garage was still playing. Some classic rock station, like the world hadn't gotten the memo yet that it was supposed to stop. She was 61 years old, and had been married to him for 36 of those years, more than half her life, longer than I'd been alive. They'd met at a community college registration line, both of them there to sign up for a night class neither of them ended up taking because they spent the whole hour in line talking instead. That was the kind of detail my mother used to tell at parties, laughing at herself for it. When he died, something in her went quiet in a way I didn't have a word for yet. She stopped laughing. Not dramatically. She didn't cry in front of people, didn't perform grief the way movies suggest widows should. She just got smaller. She sat by the window in her townhouse and watched the street, the same chair every time, angled so she could see the mailbox without anyone noticing she was watching for something that would never come back through it. She ate half of what she used to eat, and when I brought groceries, she'd thank me and then leave most of it in the fridge until it went bad. Some nights I called her just to hear her breathing on the other end of the line, not even talking, because the silence scared me less than picturing her crying alone in a house that still smelled like my father's aftershave and still had his reading glasses folded on the nightstand exactly where he'd left them the morning he died. My husband, Austin, noticed before I said anything. He's an electrical contractor, methodical and quiet, the kind of man who reads a room by watching hands instead of faces. He'll tell you he can spot when a client's about to argue about a bill by the way their fingers move before their mouth does. Invite her for Sunday dinner, he said one night, folding laundry with the particular care he gives to things he's decided matter. Squaring each towel edge like precision might make up for whatever else he couldn't fix. She shouldn't be alone with this. Not every week. I hesitated, and the hesitation had a name. Moira. Austin's mother had a talent for cruelty she dressed up as candor. I'm just being direct, she liked to say, usually right after saying something that left a mark, as if the honesty of a statement excused whatever damage it did on the way out of her mouth. She was the kind of woman who remembered every grievance anyone had ever caused her, and forgot selectively and completely every grievance she'd caused in return. Keith, his father, had learned decades ago that agreement was cheaper than argument, and he'd paid for that peace by disappearing into the furniture of every room Moira occupied. I'd watched him nod along to things I knew he didn't believe, chewing his food like chewing was the only opinion he was allowed to have, his eyes doing this small flicker toward whoever Moira had just wounded. Not quite an apology, just an acknowledgement that he'd seen it happen and wasn't going to do anything about it. Austin loved his mother in the specific, tired way of someone who'd spent 30 years being told love meant tolerance. He'd never fully defended her, but he'd never fully stood against her either, and I'd told myself for the 4 years of our marriage that this was just how families like his worked, that the calculation he was running, every time she said something cruel, was about preserving some larger piece I wasn't fully privy to. I would learn, eventually, that I'd been giving him credit for a calculation he hadn't actually been running at all. He'd just been avoiding the math. But my mother said yes before I could finish weighing it. I'd like that, she told me on the phone. I miss being at a full table. She showed up that Sunday in a gray sweater, her makeup doing careful, invisible work to cover 3 months of exhaustion. And for 1 hour, it worked. Austin told a story about a client who'd tried to pay him in frozen venison. My mother laughed, real laughter, warm and startled, like she'd forgotten she still had it in her. I watched her face come back to life in real time. I remember thinking, this was worth the risk. Then Moira set down her fork. You know, Moira said, looking directly at my mother, it's probably time you stopped acting like this. The table went still enough that I heard the refrigerator cycle on in the next room. Acting like what? I said. Moira shrugged, the particular shrug of someone who believes believes she's stating a fact everyone else is too polite to say aloud, like you're the only woman who's ever lost a husband. Everyone has problems, Debbie. Some of us just don't make a performance out of ours. My mother folded her napkin into a smaller and smaller square. She whispered an apology for existing, it seemed, for grieving in the wrong company. I saw Austin's jaw tighten enough that the muscle jumped along his cheek, but he didn't speak yet, and I told myself he was choosing his moment rather than choosing silence. That's the first rationalization I made that night, and it wouldn't be the last. Then my mother's phone rang. She stepped into the hallway to take it, and when she came back, her hands weren't steady. A pipe burst upstairs, she said. Water's coming through my bedroom ceiling. The landlord says I can't go back in tonight. Maybe not for a few days. Nobody spoke. I felt the shape of the evening shift under the table like a held breath. Austin didn't hesitate. Then you'll stay here. My mother shook her head, already retreating. I don't want to be a burden. You're not, he said. Stay as long as you need. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. Then Moira laughed. One short, incredulous bark. Absolutely not. Austin turned toward her slowly. What did you say? This is a family home, Moira said, arms crossing like a gate closing. Your wife's mother isn't our responsibility. They're asking her to leave tonight, I said. In the rain, with a flooding ceiling. Moira didn't blink. She has friends. Hotels exist. My mother stood so fast her chair scraped the floor. I should go. I caught her wrist. Sit down, Mom. Moira wasn't finished. She looked my mother dead in the eye and delivered the sentence I would replay for weeks afterward. You were invited for dinner. That doesn't make you family enough to move in. My mother's eyes filled. I felt something in my own chest go cold and very still. This is our house, I said. You don't decide who stays here. Moira ignored me entirely, her eyes still fixed on my mother like she was savoring something. Austin stood. For 1 second, I believed he was about to end this cleanly, in front of everyone. Instead, his mother leaned toward him and said, quiet enough that I had to strain to hear it. Can I speak to you? Alone. They left the room together. Keith wiped his mouth with his napkin, unbothered, almost pleased, like a man watching a play whose ending he already knew. I sat there holding my mother's trembling hand and listening to the muffled shape of a conversation through drywall. Moira's voice sharp and certain, Austin's low and even, no words distinct enough to catch. A full minute passed, then the door opened. Moira walked back in first, smiling like she'd already won something. Keith straightened in his seat. Austin came in behind them and shut the door. He looked at his mother, his father, my mother, still shaking beside me. Now pack your things. I want to tell you I understood immediately what he meant. I didn't. For one terrible second I thought he meant my mother, and I felt the floor of my marriage tilt sideways. Then he said the rest of it. You, he told his mother, and you, to his father, are leaving. Debbie is staying as long as she needs. I'm not doing this again, Mom. Not to her, not in my house. Moira's face did something I had never seen it do before. It cracked. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it, that Moira and Keith left, chastened, and my mother's ceiling got fixed, and life resumed its ordinary shape. It wasn't, and it didn't. What actually happened over the following 6 weeks taught me that Moira didn't lose an argument that night. She lost a round, and she intended to win the fight. My mother's landlord, a tired man named Ray, who owned 4 units and clearly wished he owned 0, sent an inspector 2 days later. I went with her because by then I'd already smelled the particular sourness that tells you a water problem has stopped being a plumbing issue and started being a health issue. That flat, faintly sweet mustiness that clings to the back of your throat before your eyes ever confirm what your nose already knows. The inspector, a soft-spoken man who introduced himself as having done residential moisture assessments for 19 years, walked the bedroom with a handheld meter, pressing it against the drywall in a grid pattern, calling out numbers to his own recorder in a voice so calm it almost made the numbers sound reasonable. His report used a phrase that made my stomach drop when I read it later that night at my kitchen table. Visible microbial growth consistent with sustained moisture exposure, estimated onset prior to reported incident. Translation, which I gave my mother as gently as I could, sitting across from her while she turned a mug of untouched tea in slow circles. This pipe hadn't just burst that Sunday. It had been slowly failing for weeks, maybe longer, sweating through a joint no one had reason to check, and nobody had caught it because nobody had looked, least of all Ray, whose maintenance log, I asked to see it, professional habit, hadn't been updated in 14 months. My mother's homeowners, well, renters-like insurance situation was a mess I understood better than most people would, and understanding it didn't make it less infuriating. Ray's landlord policy covered structural repair to the building itself, drywall, subfloor, the pipe. It did not cover my mother's ruined mattress, the water-damaged boxes of my father's old letters that had been stacked, unluckily, directly beneath the worst of the ceiling failure, or the mold remediation required for her actual living space as distinct from the building's bare frame. I filed a personal property claim on her behalf with her own renter's insurance, a policy she'd bought 11 years earlier at my insistence and never once used, premium after premium, just in case. I photographed everything before any of it got touched. The water line on the baseboard, the swollen cardboard, the ceiling stain shaped almost exactly like the state of Florida, which would have been funny under literally any other circumstance. I told myself the paperwork would move faster because I knew which words mattered, which boxes to check, which adjuster's language would get a claim triaged instead of shelved. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. Moira and Keith left our house that night, but Moira didn't disappear. She started calling Austin's sister, Priya, first. Priya told me this herself herself over coffee 2 weeks later, stirring a cappuccino she never drank, looking uncomfortable in a way she clearly wasn't used to feeling around her own mother. She said you'd installed your mother in the house, Priya told me, hedging the word with air quotes she didn't need to make, since I could already hear Moira's exact inflection through Priya's retelling of it. Her words. Like Debbie was a home security system somebody bolted to the wall without a permit. Then Moira started calling Austin directly, sometimes twice a day, always in the window between 4 and 6 when he was driving home from job sites, and couldn't easily end the call by claiming he had somewhere to be. I only knew the content of those calls because Austin, to his credit, told me about most of them, even when it clearly cost him something to repeat what his own mother had said out loud in our kitchen. She told him Debbie was manipulating his sympathy, that grief was being used as a kind of leverage. She told him grief had an expiration date and Debbie had exceeded it. 91 days, she said once, like she'd actually counted. Like there was a statute of limitations on missing your husband of 36 years. She told him, in a call he described to me with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder, that if he kept choosing outsiders over his own blood, he'd regret it when she and Keith needed him someday, the way people always regret exactly what they were warned about, in exactly the tone that warning was delivered. She started texting too, shorter messages that read almost reasonable in isolation, and only revealed their shape when you lined a dozen of them up end to end. Just checking in, any update on how long Dee is staying? Not trying to be difficult, just want to plan family time that doesn't feel crowded. Would love to have Sunday dinners be our family again sometime. Austin forwarded me a few of them, unprompted, which I understood even then as its own kind of message. Not proof he needed backup exactly, but proof he wanted a witness. I rationalized this the way you rationalize a smoke detector that keeps chirping at 3 a.m. Annoying, surely temporary, surely not actually a fire. I told myself Moira would exhaust herself eventually, that some people just needed time to grieve a version of Sundays they'd lost. I was wrong about that too, and I'd be wrong about it 2 more times before I let myself see the shape of what was actually happening. It was Priya, again, who gave me the piece I didn't know I was missing. We were folding laundry, my mother's laundry actually, since Debbie had moved into our guest room by then, and I'd started doing a load of towels every few days without really registering it as a habit. The way you stop noticing a routine has quietly become permanent. When Priya said carefully, refolding the same towel twice before she got the sentence out, "You know this isn't the first time, right?" I asked her what she meant. Dad's sister, Aunt Ruth. She stayed with them for 4 months after her divorce, back before you and Austin got together. I was maybe 14, so I mostly remember it in pieces. Mom did the same thing then, not all at once, more like erosion. Little comments about how long Ruth was staying, jokes at dinner that weren't really jokes, this running commentary about how Ruth needed to get back on her feet that somehow never applied to anyone else who'd ever had a rough year, making her feel like a guest who'd overstayed a welcome she never actually got in the first place. Ruth found her own place eventually, moved 2 states away, and now she barely speaks to any of us. Sends a card at Christmas, that's about it. I always figured it was just a family thing that happened, the kind of drift families have. I don't think I let myself call it a pattern until just now, saying it out loud to you and hearing how much it sounds like what's happening with your mom. I sat with that for a long time after Priya left, turning it over the way I'd turn over a claim file that suddenly had a second incident attached to it, because that's exactly what it was, in the part of my brain that never fully clocks out of work mode. 1 bad night is an incident. 2 incidents, 6 years apart, with the same person at the center of both, following a similar shape. A vulnerable relative arrives, gets slowly, deniably worn down until leaving looks like the vulnerable person's own choice. That's not an incident anymore. That's a pattern, and patterns tell you something incidents alone can't. What's likely to happen next if nothing intervenes. It also told me something useful, something almost clinical in its clarity once I let myself see it. This wasn't going to resolve itself with time, the way I'd been hoping. It was going to keep happening, quietly and legibly, unless something made it stop. Here is the moment everything shifted from a family conflict into something with actual documentation attached to it. 3 weeks after the dinner, I got a call from my claims supervisor, not about my mother's case, which I'd properly recused myself from handling directly, but a courtesy heads up because he'd noticed the file and knew my name was attached as a family member. Someone called Ray's insurance carrier, he told me, claiming to have information that the water damage claim was fraudulent, that the tenant, quote, staged the timeline to move in with relatives for financial reasons. My hands went cold before my brain finished the sentence. "Do you know who called?" I asked, already knowing. Female caller, didn't give a name to the rep, but she gave enough personal detail about your mother, her address, her son-in-law's name, specifics about a dinner, that whoever it was clearly knew the family. He paused. "Renata, I have to ask, is there something happening here I need to know about, given your recusal?" There was a lot happening. None of it, until that phone call, had been the kind of thing you could point to in an incident report. A phone call to an insurance carrier making unfounded fraud allegations against a claimant, that was no longer a family dynamic. That was interference with an active claim, and it was the kind of thing that left a trail. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it wasn't dramatic in the way you'd expect. Nobody got arrested. There were no flashing lights. What happened was slower and, in its way, more thorough. My supervisor connected me with the carrier's Special Investigations Unit, where I spoke with an investigator named Marcus Chen, who'd spent 14 years doing fraud investigation work, 6 with with a Metro Police Financial Crimes Unit before that, he mentioned once, almost in passing, before moving into Carrier Side SIU. He was calm in the specific way people are calm when they've heard every version of a family falling apart and stopped being surprised by any of them. Though I noticed he still took notes carefully, like the volume of things he'd seen hadn't made him careless about any individual one. Anonymous tips against claimants happen more than people think, he told me over the phone, papers shuffling faintly on his end of the line. Most of the time they're noise, a bitter ex, a jealous neighbor, someone who read too much into a Facebook post. Sometimes they're not, and we have to run every single one down regardless of the source, because if there's actual fraud, we need to know it, and if there isn't, we need to close the door on it formally, in writing, so it can never be raised again against your mother in some future claim. He asked for the carrier's recorded call log. Insurance companies record fraud tip lines by policy for exactly this reason, retained for a minimum of 2 years per the carrier's compliance standards, and I gave him written permission, as my mother's authorized point of contact on file, to request the recording be pulled, logged into the investigation file, and reviewed under SIU protocol. The recording took 9 days to retrieve through the carrier's internal request process. When Marcus called me back, his voice had the particular flatness people use when they're being professionally neutral about something they privately find distasteful. I can't share the full audio with you directly since your mother isn't the one requesting it, he said, but I can tell you the voice on record identified specific relationship details that match what you've described to me, and I can tell you the claim itself has now been fully validated on our end. The pre-existing pipe deterioration was confirmed by a licensed inspector. The timeline holds up, and there's no fraud indicator in your mother's file whatsoever. I asked him what happened to false fraud tips that turn out to be malicious. Depends on jurisdiction, he said. Filing a false report to an insurance company isn't automatically criminal, but depending on the state, if it's shown to be deliberately false and made to cause harm, it can expose the caller to civil liability. Tortious interference in some cases, if it's proven the call was made specifically to damage the claimant's position. That's a civil matter, not something my unit pursues, but if your mother wanted to explore that route, an attorney could tell her whether it's worth pursuing. That's when I called Diane Farrow, an elder law attorney I'd worked with twice before on claims involving older clients, someone with 22 years in practice who specialized in exactly the kind of situation I didn't have language for yet. Not elder abuse in the dramatic sense, but the slower, more deniable kind. Financial interference, isolation tactics, campaigns designed to destabilize an older person's independence and support system. Diane listened to the whole timeline without interrupting, which I'd learned was one of her professional habits. What you're describing, she said finally, isn't uncommon, and it isn't accidental. Deliberately interfering with an insurance claim to make a vulnerable relative look unstable or dishonest, combined with a documented pattern with a prior family member, that's not just bad behavior, that's a strategy. Whether you pursue any formal action is up to your mother, but I'd strongly recommend documenting everything, in writing, starting now, in case this escalates further. She helped my mother draft a written record, dates, calls, the fraud tip incident, Priya's account of the pattern with Aunt Ruth, not to file a lawsuit, but so that if this family decides to have a real conversation about what happened, there's a record that isn't just memory versus memory. Crisis peak. The peak of all of it landed on a Thursday, 6 weeks after the dinner, and it came in the form of an ultimatum I hadn't seen coming from the person I least expected to deliver one. Keith. He called Austin directly, which he almost never did, and asked to meet him alone. No Moira present. Austin told me about it that night, sitting on the edge of our bed with his hands loosely clasped, staring at the floor the way he does when he's working up to something difficult. Dad told me Mom knows about the insurance call being traced back, he said. He said she's terrified, not guilty, terrified of consequences. And he said if I don't shut this whole thing down by getting Debbie to formally drop any complaint and agreeing as a family to never discuss it again, Mom's going to tell everyone that Debbie's the one who's been destabilizing the family this whole time, that she'll make sure Debbie's the villain in every version anyone hears. I felt my pulse in my ears. Did he say what happens if you don't? He said she'll stop speaking to me, maybe to both of us. He made it sound like an actual deadline, like I had until Sunday to decide. I want to tell you I had some clever plan in that moment. I didn't. What I had was 24 hours of genuinely not knowing whether my husband would fold under the specific, engineered pressure of losing his mother entirely, or whether he'd hold the line he'd drawn that first Sunday. My hands didn't stop shaking that whole night. I kept rereading Diane's documentation notes like they were something I could hold on to physically. Austin didn't sleep either. Around 2 a.m., he said into the dark, I keep thinking about Aunt Ruth, how we all just let her disappear from the family and called it distance instead of what it actually was. He was quiet for a long time. I'm not doing that to your mother. I don't care what the deadline is. Austin didn't wait for Sunday. He called a family meeting himself, his parents, Priya, my mother present as well, because he told me flatly, if they're going to talk about her, she gets to be in the room. Moira arrived expecting, I think, to control the room the way she always had. She hadn't accounted for Priya bringing her own memory of Aunt Ruth into the conversation out loud for the first time in front of everyone. She hadn't accounted for Austin laying out, calmly and without raising his voice, the fraud tip haul, Marcus Chen's confirmation that the claim was fully legitimate, and Diane's plain observation that a documented pattern existed across just two separate relatives, 6 years apart. This isn't a misunderstanding, Austin told her. You called an insurance company and lied about my wife's mother to try to make her look like a criminal because you couldn't accept that she was staying in my house. That's not directness, Mom. That's not honesty. That's just cruelty with better vocabulary. Moira didn't confess. Not exactly. She reached, first, for the same script that had worked her whole life. I was protecting this family. No one appreciates what I sacrifice. You're all turning this into something it isn't. But the room didn't move with her this time. Keith, who'd spent 30 years agreeing with her to keep the peace, said one sentence that seemed to cost him more than anything else that day. I told her not to make that call, Moira. I told her and she did it anyway. It wasn't a courtroom. Nobody was charged with anything. Diane had been clear from the start that pursuing civil action would cost my mother more in stress than it would likely recover in any judgment. And my mother, when asked, said quietly that she didn't want a lawsuit. She wanted to stop being afraid of a phone ringing. What she got instead was smaller and, I think, more lasting. Austin told his mother that visits to our home would be limited and supervised by distance for the foreseeable future. Not a permanent exile, but a consequence with real weight, tied explicitly to what she'd done. Priya, for her own reasons, began quietly rebuilding contact with Aunt Ruth, reaching out after 6 years of inherited silence to say simply that the family had gotten it wrong the first time. My mother's claim closed 2 weeks later, fully paid, mold remediation covered, the false fraud flag formally cleared from her file. Marcus made sure of that himself, unprompted, so it never surfaces again if she ever files another claim in her life. My mother still lives with us. Not because the ceiling never got fixed. It did, eventually, and Ray even apologized awkwardly for how long the repairs took, but because by the time her apartment was livable again, none of us particularly wanted her to go. Least of all her. She laughs now more than she did that first Sunday. Not the same laugh she had when my father was alive. I don't think that laugh survives a loss like hers unchanged, but something adjacent to it. Something that's found its own shape in the year since. Moira still calls occasionally. The calls are shorter now, more careful. I don't know if that's growth or just caution, and I've stopped needing to know which. Some repairs don't require the other person's understanding to hold. What I keep coming back to when I think about that dinner is how close it came to going the other way. How easily, now pack your things, could have meant my mother if Austin had made a different choice in that hallway. I've stopped assuming I know what anyone will do under pressure, including the people I love most. I've started paying closer attention to what they actually do instead. That, more than any insurance claim or documented pattern, turned out to be the only evidence that mattered.